So today, as I explained last week, this is my concluding talk on Dogen's work entitled Uji, or Being Time, and its implications for study and practice with Dogen's writings. Last week I introduced and explained the qualities of Dogen's being time related to form and to each of us. And basically, being and time are identities. Being is time, time is being. Being is exactly time, time is exactly being. Being or form is illuminated by time in boundless interrelatedness, intimate connection. Each moment of being time is complete and contains all things. But if you heard the talk, you know that I posed some questions, and the most important one at the beginning was, how do we work on transcending our separateness, our kind of dualistic experience, our conventional views? And I suggested that Uji, or being time, at least on a conceptual level, could help us doubt our everyday view of reality. Being time offers such a lens. In fact, Dogen kind of also blows up the lens, our eyes, and conscious perceptions. But first, Dogen is not easy to read. It's not easy to study. And so what's a good way of studying Dogen, or any Zen literature for that matter? Well, last week's talk I modeled some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, what's the context? Well, Uji is a fascicle, or installment, if you will, of the masterwork of him, Dogen's called Shobogenzo. And that's a collection then that's actually was written over many, many years. In Soto Zen, we often study the Ginjo Koan, which is usually the first installment in a collection. And it was written in 1233. So he was a young man still, 33 years old, approximately. Uji was written in 1240. So Ginjo Koan was written before that. And of course, remember Dogen over there on the wall, he died, he was only about 53 or so. So he didn't live to an old age. But the work of Uji, or Being Time, is a little more mature work, you might say. What about translations? Translations can be very, very important. The one I used is from the book The Moon in a Dewdrop, translated by Welch and Tanahashi. And the bonus of that is you can find that text on the internet. Then I mentioned last week koan references. And Dogen had a very close familiarity with koan literature, with Chinese literary references, even Chinese slang he would throw in. So what do we do with this? Well, Uji, as it turns out, it has 19 sections. And some of them do depend heavily on koan references. And of course, we don't practice that, especially sections 1, 15, 16, and 19. So what do we do with those? Do we just not read Uji at all, or any of Dogen? No, I found that actually skipping over some of those references really didn't impair the essence of what he was talking about with being time. I think there's still benefit of studying our Japanese ancestor and our lineage, at least for the more accessible parts. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Also, commentaries. Commentaries are extremely important and helpful. So you can consult books, articles, podcasts by recognized Zen teachers, especially in our Soto tradition, our lineage. Last week, you'll remember I quoted Norman Fisher, who's a noted teacher he's a Dharma era of Suzuki Roshi. And happily, he does have a podcast series on Uji that can be accessed online, along with the transcript. So just listening to it in a sitting like a Dharma talk, or even a podcast, you might kind of get lost. But with a with repeating the podcast or reading the transcript, sometimes it's a little more helpful. You're doing more than just auditory processing. I also quoted Shohaka Okamura, who wrote another book called Realizing Genjo Koan, which you remember was the first fascicle or installment of Shobo Genzo. And we actually studied that at Empty Nest. And so those commentators are pretty well known. Practicing with any Dogen, of course, besides maybe setting aside some more obscure koan references, help from other commentators is important. And then reading and studying, just surveying the whole work, reading the introduction, reading footnotes. And then what I did was section by section, all 19 sections, and then really sentence by sentence. Sometimes you just have to read things and let them percolate. And you won't understand everything necessarily, but in other words, you don't worry about what doesn't make immediate sense. What makes sense to you? And that leads to my next point, which I think was extremely helpful for me. I think you do this with your precept, is writing your own version. I first heard that with Peter Shearson and did that, and that was of great benefit. And you notice that I modeled that last week. I said, well, here's my comment, here's my version. And it doesn't have to be perfect, and it may be written with dualistic terms, but at least you start to get kind of an elbow into Dogen's insight. And then it's helpful to alternate studying with just sitting. And you could, if you want, sometimes I do, just start with an intention before I start Zazen of this moment is all being, or something like that, and then just let go of it and sit with it. So what about the practice pointers from the work Being Time itself? Well, as I said last week, Dogen says that you need to really question and doubt your conventional experience or understanding. He says, even though you do not measure the hours of the day as long and short, far or near, you still call it a day. Back then they called it 12 hours instead of 24, but you get the idea. He says, because its signs of time's coming and going are so obvious, people do not doubt it. And although they don't doubt it, they do not understand it. Or when sentient beings doubt what they don't understand, their doubt is not firmly fixed. In other words, what he's saying, you don't know what you don't know, but you never really investigated it. You've never really investigated it or doubted it. But then he adds, this is in the second section, he has like a little sense of humor, I think. Then he adds, yet your doubt itself is simply a moment of being time. which is absolutely true. Last week I mentioned that he says, do not think that time merely flies away. If time flew away, you'd be separated from time, you wouldn't be here, in other words. And then he added to that, the reason you do not clearly see being time is you think that time is only passing. All things, he said, in the entire world are linked with one another as moments, because all moments are the being time. They are your being time. So my version was, all things are intimately linked in this moment. Regarding delusion, in section 9 he says, although the views of an ordinary person, that's code for delusion, and the causes and conditions of those views are what us ordinary people see, they're not necessarily our truth. The truth merely manifests itself as the time being, as an ordinary person. So your delusion, remember, is just a moment of time being. Because you think your time or your being is not truth, you believe that the truth is not you. Substitute truth with the word Buddha. However, your attempts to escape from being the Buddha is nothing but bits and pieces of being time. Causes and conditions are creating that, to making that happen for you. Those who have not yet confirmed this should look into it deeply. I think that sounds like a practice exhortation, I believe. And it ties back to Dogen's fundamental question. If we're innately enlightened, why do we need a practice? Well, yeah, there's the answer. Because delusion happens to come up in the time being for us, that we can't see that. And Norman Fisher, he gave his translation, which is basically the same. We have our views and we have sensible reasons, but they're not really who we are. And he says that simple truth manifests itself for the time being as you and me as our various conventional views. Because we don't realize this and believe so much in our views, we believe we know who and what we are and who and what everybody else is. And here's the kicker, is punchline. We are convinced that we're ordinary persons and not enlightened Buddhas. I just like to read, I like reading that and letting it just sit in, just sink in. The second area is this whole thing about time. He says, see each thing in this entire world as a moment of time. And then he throws in, this is in section 3, the way-seeking mind, which is about practice, of course. That arises in this moment. A way-seeking mind, a way-seeking moment arises in the mind, and it's the same with practice or even attaining the way. The self setting itself in a ray sees itself. This is the understanding that the self is time. My version is the self in capital letters, the big self, manifests itself in the form of all existence. And of course that it harkens back to the Genjo Koan. Study the self is to forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. So you see, even though it's a later work, you hear echoes of his other statements and works. Recall that Dogen spoke of flowing and the imagery of the flowing in spring, right, last week. In section 8, he says, the time being has the quality of flowing. And he says, practice enlightenment is the time being also. And remember last week that phrase, practice enlightenment, a hyphenated phrase, one concept in Dogen's mind. That practice, the moment of sitting, is also enlightenment. But then he adds a little final line, and this proves that Dogen kind of has a sense of humor. He says, but being splattered with mud and getting wet with water is also being time. So don't get so highfalutin that being time is all only for marvelous practice experiences. It's also very ordinary. Love is humor. The third thing is to practice with our notions of form. He says, know that there are myriads of forms and hundreds of grasses, meaning varieties of things, throughout the entire earth, and yet each grass and each form itself is the entire earth. The study of this is the beginning of practice. And then he adds later in section 4, since there is nothing but just this moment, the being time is all the time there is. Grass being, form being, are all time. Each moment is all being, is the entire world. Reflect now whether any being or any world is left out of this present moment. It's not possible. Nothing is left out. So last week I suggested, you may accept that you're not alive yesterday or tomorrow, but only right now. And you may accept that if the illumination of time failed right now, you wouldn't be alive or conscious, wouldn't exist in whatever form this moment is. And that should connect you to the importance of uji, or being time. And of course, that also challenges our dualistic views. The final point is to actualize uji. And in section 10 he says, at this time you enlighten the entire world, meaning as a Buddha. To fully actualize the entire world with the entire world is called thorough practice. It's also practice enlightenment, isn't it? He says, to arouse the way-seeking mind, to practice, to inner enlightenment, even to enter nirvana, is nothing but being, nothing but time. So throughout every stage of practice, each is being time, each a moment. My comment, the statement makes it pretty hard to just outright dismiss the study of Dogen or being time. But practice is beyond me seeing cause and effect as a rational concept, even though that might be a place to start my intellectual doubting, questioning. But then actualizing cause and effect as being time without separation. Now last week I also mentioned just actualize all time as all being. There's nothing extra. There's nothing extra in this moment. And then he adds, vigorously abiding in each moment is the being time. And then, of course, last week I said he cautioned us not to take it as nothing or no being, nihilism, nor permanent being. In other words, the middle path. And then he said, I mentioned last week, he said, the being time is entirely actualized without being caught up in nets or cages. And then he said that closely examine the flowing of time. Without your complete effort right now, nothing would be actualized, nothing would flow. So my version is being time is beyond grasping or conceptual understanding. And the flowing through all things is not separate from the flowing through me or through you. Our practice is necessary to realize it. And again, that's the answer to his fundamental question, isn't it? So, of course, my versions or statements do use relativistic words, as you will. If you actually write your understanding of a section or work of Dogen or any other Zen literature. And this is a Dharma talk, and so we have to use language in some way to help clarify and point to reality that's ultimately indescribable. So in conclusion, how do we transcend this experience of separateness? Well, Uji, I think, gives us some pointers. Examining, questioning, doubting our views of time and being. Realizing that we're only alive in this being time moment, each moment, probably also helpful. And realizing without the illumination of time of each moment, you, me, anything else who doesn't exist. But then, of course, you need to let go of the small self and its views and actualize no separation with everything. Remember, last week I said that we're not sitting for a future enlightenment when we sit. So if we think we're chasing a future enlightenment, we need to realize that. We need to wake up to that. Practice includes realizing what is in this moment each and every moment. Dropping the veil of separateness and dropping the views to create your doubt about your enlightened nature.